Welcome to the darkest corner of human history, where we're about to explore the most horrifying ways people have bid farewell to this mortal coil. But before we dive in, let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to be cooked alive in a bronze bull while your screams are transformed into melodious music? No? Well, neither had King Phalaris of Sicily until he became the victim of his own torture device. But we'll get to that deliciously ironic story later. Right now, you're probably thinking, why would I want to know about history's worst deaths? Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why these stories aren't just about shock value. They're fascinating windows into human nature, scientific progress, and the sometimes absurd twists of fate that remind us how precious and precarious life truly is. Think of this as a roller coaster ride through time's deadliest hits. And speaking of hits, did you know that in 1919, a man met his end by drowning in 2 million gallons of molasses? That's right, death by dessert. But that's just the appetizer for what's coming. Now, let's start our journey with what might be the most ironic death in human history. The case of Chrysippus, a Greek philosopher who quite literally died laughing. In 206 BCE, after getting his donkey drunk on wine. Yes, you heard that right. He found the sight of the inebriated animal attempting to eat figs so hilarious that he fell into an uncontrollable fit of laughter. The result? A fatal heart attack. But that's just the beginning of our exploration into history's most fascinating final moments. Today, we're going to uncover deaths so bizarre that they seem like fiction, yet every single one is historically documented. Let's kick things off with what I consider the most scientifically fascinating death in history, the case of Louis Slotin, a physicist who, in 1946, accidentally created a nuclear reaction with his bare hands. Picture this: Los Alamos Laboratory, the birthplace of the atomic bomb. Slotin was performing a dangerous experiment known as tickling the dragon's tail, which involved bringing 2 hemispheres of plutonium nearly together to create a controlled nuclear reaction. On that fateful day, his screwdriver slipped, the hemispheres touched, and the air in the room literally began to glow blue from radiation. Slotin's quick thinking saved everyone else in the room. He knocked the hemispheres apart with his bare hand, absorbing a lethal dose of radiation in the process. But here's where it gets both fascinating and horrifying. For the next 9 days, scientists had a front row seat to observe, for the first time, what acute radiation poisoning does to a human body. Slotin's death wasn't just a tragedy. It became a cornerstone of our understanding of radiation's effects on the human body. His sacrifice led to the development of remote-controlled testing mechanisms that would prevent similar accidents in the future. But perhaps even more intriguing is the story of Gary Hoy, a Toronto lawyer who, in 1993, died trying to prove a point about unbreakable glass. Hoy had a habit of demonstrating the strength of his office building's windows by throwing himself against them. He'd done it many times before, always bouncing off harmlessly. But on this particular day, while showing off to visiting law students, something went wrong. The glass didn't break. It popped out of its frame entirely. Hoy plunged 24 stories to his death, proving that while the glass was indeed unbreakable, the window frame wasn't quite as reliable. In a twist of irony that would make even Shakespeare raise an eyebrow, his last words were reportedly, "Watch this. Let's pause for a moment and consider something. What these deaths teach us isn't just about the myriad ways humans can meet their end. They're about hubris, innovation, and sometimes just plain bad luck. They remind us that death doesn't discriminate between the brilliant physicist pushing the boundaries of science and the lawyer trying to impress some students." Now, let's travel back to ancient Rome, where we encounter what might be the most elaborate death in history: the fate of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. You might think being wealthy would guarantee you a peaceful death, but Crassus's end proves otherwise. In 53 BCE, after losing a crucial battle to the Parthians, Crassus was captured. The Parthians, known for their dark sense of humor, decided to give him exactly what he'd spent his life pursuing: gold. They executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat, literally making him drink his wealth. Talk about dying rich. But if you think that's brutal, wait until you hear about George Plantagenet, 1st Duke of Clarence, who in 1478 was allegedly granted the unique privilege of choosing how he would be executed for treason against his brother, King Edward IV of England. His choice: drowning in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Now that's what I call going out in style. Although, I have to wonder if he considered the cleanup crew. Let's fast forward to the 20th century, where we meet Frank Hayes, who achieved something truly remarkable in 1923. He won a horse race after he was already dead. Hayes suffered a heart attack mid-race, but remained perfectly seated on his horse, which crossed the finish line first. He remains the only jockey to win a race posthumously. Talk about dedication to the sport. Speaking of unexpected endings, let me introduce you to the dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg, France. It started with one woman dancing fervently in the street. Within a month, around 400 people had joined in, dancing continuously for days without rest. Many danced themselves to death from heart attacks, exhaustion, and strokes. Historians still debate what caused this bizarre event. Was it mass hysteria, food poisoning, or something else entirely? But perhaps one of the most fascinating deaths in history belongs to Tycho Brahe, the 16th century Danish astronomer. For years, people believed he died from a bladder infection after refusing to excuse himself during a banquet, because it would have been a breach of etiquette. However, recent analysis of his remains revealed something far more intriguing: mercury poisoning. Whether it was from his alchemical experiments or assassination remains a mystery. Either way, it's a reminder that sometimes the most interesting part of a death isn't how it happened, but what it reveals about the person and their time. Now, let's talk about what I consider the most bizarre workplace accident in history: the Great Molasses Flood of 1919 in Boston. A massive tank of molasses collapsed, sending a 15-foot wave of sticky sweetness through the streets at 35 miles per hour. 21 people died, not in a blaze of glory, but in a slow, sticky disaster that literally stuck around. They say on hot summer days, you can still smell molasses in that neighborhood. But wait, it gets weirder. In 1567, Hans Steininger, the man with the longest beard in the world, died after tripping over his own beard during a fire evacuation. He normally kept his 4.5-foot beard rolled up in a leather pouch, but on this fateful day, he forgot. One misstep, and history lost its most impressive facial hair enthusiast. And speaking of impressive feats, let's discuss the peculiar case of Clement Vallandigham, a lawyer who in 1871 accidentally shot himself dead while demonstrating how his client's alleged victim might have accidentally shot himself. The silver lining? He won the case posthumously. Now, that's what I call taking one for the team. These deaths, as bizarre as they may seem, teach us something profound about human nature. Whether it's our pursuit of knowledge, our desire to prove a point, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time, each one tells a story about who we are as a species. Now, let me introduce you to what might be the most metal death in history. And I mean that literally. In 1567, there was an Austrian nobleman named Baron Hans von Hohenzollern who had the brilliant idea of growing a metal beard. Yes, you heard that right. He had his regular beard woven with copper wire to make it more impressive. One day, lightning struck. I think you can guess what happened next. He became history's first and last human lightning rod. But let's dive into something even more bizarre. The case of the Dyatlov Pass incident in 1959. 9 experienced Russian hikers died under circumstances so mysterious that they continue to baffle experts today. They fled their tent in the middle of the night, cutting their way out from the inside, running barefoot into sub-zero temperatures. Some were found with crushed ribs despite no external injuries, others with radiation burns, and one was missing her tongue. The official cause of death? A compelling natural force. Thanks for clearing that up, Soviet investigators. Speaking of compelling forces, let's talk about Gloria Ramirez, known as the Toxic Lady. In 1994, she was admitted to a California hospital with cardiac issues. As medical staff treated her, they began fainting one by one. Her blood had a strange sheen and smelled of garlic. By the end of the night, 23 hospital staff were ill, and Ramirez was dead. The leading theory? Her body had become a chemical factory due to a unique combination of medications and treatments, essentially turning her into a walking chemical weapon. But if you think that's strange, wait until you hear about the case of Sigurd the Mighty, a 9th century Viking earl who managed to kill himself with his enemy's head. After defeating his foe Male Brick, he decapitated him and tied the head to his horse's saddle as a trophy. The problem? Male Brick had buck teeth that scratched Sigurd's leg as he rode, causing an infection that killed him. Talk about getting the last laugh. And speaking of laughs, let's discuss the peculiar demise of Thomas Urquhart, a 17th century Scottish aristocrat who allegedly died from laughing too hard upon learning that Charles II had taken the throne. But here's the kicker. He was known for making up fantastical stories about himself, so even his death became part of his legacy of questionable tales. Now, let me tell you about Alan Pinkerton, the famous detective who founded the Pinkerton Detective Agency. This man survived multiple assassination attempts and countless dangerous missions, only to die in 1884 from gangrene after biting his own tongue when he slipped on a sidewalk. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is just a poorly maintained pavement. But perhaps the most fascinating death in terms of historical impact belongs to Arius, a 4th century priest in Alexandria. On the way to force the church to accept his controversial teachings, he stopped at a public bathroom and reportedly died from his intestines explosively exiting his body. His supporters claimed he was poisoned, while his enemies saw it as divine judgment. Either way, it changed the course of early Christian theology. And let's not forget about the death of King Adolf Fredrik of Sweden in 1771, who literally ate himself to death. His last meal consisted of lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, kippers, champagne, and 14 servings of his favorite dessert served in a bowl of hot milk. They actually had to create a new Swedish phrase because of this, äta sig död, which means to eat oneself to death. These deaths, as outlandish as they may seem, remind us of an important truth. No matter how powerful, clever, or careful you are, fate has a way of writing endings that no one could predict. Each of these stories serves as a bizarre footnote in the grand narrative of human history, teaching us that while death is inevitable, the way we get there can be surprisingly creative. Now, let me share with you what I consider the most poetic death in history, the case of Isadora Duncan, the famous dancer who revolutionized modern dance. In 1927, while riding in an open car in Nice, France, her signature long scarf got caught in the wheel of the vehicle. The scarf, which had been hand-painted by a Russian artist, became entangled in the axle, instantly breaking her neck. She died doing what she loved, being dramatic. But if you think that's ironic, wait until you hear about the inventor of the Segway, Jimmy Heselden. Well, technically he wasn't the inventor, but the owner of the company. In 2010, he accidentally drove his Segway off a cliff while inspecting his property. The machine designed to revolutionize personal transportation led to its owner's demise. Speaking of inventors meeting unfortunate ends, let's talk about Franz Reichelt, also known as the Flying Tailor. In 1912, this ambitious fashion designer decided to test his new invention, a coat that could double as a parachute. He chose the Eiffel Tower as his testing ground, despite warnings from friends and officials. He insisted on being his own test dummy. The coat shoot failed spectacularly, and the whole tragic event was captured on film. The saddest part? He had tested the design with dummies before, and they all showed it wouldn't work. Now, let me tell you about what might be the most expensive death in history. Li Wenliang, the Chinese doctor who first warned about COVID-19. Though his death in 2020 wasn't particularly bizarre, its impact on global history and economics makes it worth mentioning. His early warnings, if heeded, might have changed the course of the pandemic. Sometimes, the most significant deaths aren't the most spectacular ones. But speaking of spectacular, let's not forget Tennessee Williams, the famous playwright, who died in 1983 by choking on a bottle cap. The cap belonged to his eye drop bottle, and he had a habit of holding it between his teeth while applying the drops. One night, he accidentally swallowed it. A man who wrote some of the most profound dialogues in theater history was ultimately silenced by a plastic cap. These deaths, each unique in their own way, remind us of the thin line between tragedy and comedy that runs through human existence. They show us that life, no matter how well planned, can take unexpected turns. But more importantly, they teach us that even in death, we can leave behind stories that continue to fascinate, educate, and sometimes even amuse future generations. And so, as we conclude this journey through history's most remarkable exits, remember, while we can't choose when or how we'll leave this world, we can choose how we live in it. Just maybe avoid keeping pigs on balconies, testing homemade parachutes, or wearing extremely long scarves and convertibles.